a phenomenological perspective on the ICF. The ICF, International Classification of Functioning, is a framework for describing health and disability. Beyond classification, it invites us to reflect on how people actually live with their conditions. This video explores the ICF from a phenomenological perspective, focusing on lived experience rather than fixed categories. By reinterpreting the ICF in this way, we can view health and disability as dynamic, context-dependent experiences shaped through everyday life. Introduction. The ICF, which stands for the International Classification of Functioning, Disability, and Health, is a framework developed by the World Health Organization back in 2000. Think of it as a standardized way to describe health and disability-related conditions. It's used by clinicians, policymakers, researchers, and educators around the world to collect statistics on disability and guide practice. The story behind the ICF. Before the ICF, there was something called the ICIDH, or the International Classification of Impairments, Disabilities, and Handicaps. This earlier system, introduced in 1980, had a pretty straightforward but limited view of how disability worked. Here's how the ICIDH saw it. A disease would cause an impairment, which is a loss or problem with body structure or function. This impairment would then lead to a disability, essentially trouble performing activities. And that disability would result in a handicap, meaning disadvantages in social participation. So, was there a problem with the ICIDH? This was a one-way street. Disease led to impairment, impairment led to disability, disability led to handicap. But real life isn't that simple, is it? This model couldn't account for how things might work in reverse, such as how being excluded socially might actually make impairments worse. Around 1984, medical professionals started talking about something called disuse syndrome, which refers to the idea that not using your body actually makes function decline. This was a hint that the relationship between activity and health was more complex than the old model suggested. While the ICIDH made a big impact on medical rehabilitation, it never quite achieved its goal of creating comprehensive international disability statistics. It was just too limited in how it thought about disability. Well, it was just an appendix after all. Enter the ICF, a more complex picture. The ICF was designed to tackle the complex, multifaceted nature of how we actually function in real life. But here's the thing. Because it's trying to capture something so complex, it can be pretty difficult to understand and use in practice. The framework is still evolving. Take this example. In the ICF's famous diagram, activity and participation are shown as separate concepts. But when you look at the actual classification codes, they're lumped together, with just an optional marker to tell them apart. In real clinical work, it's often unclear where activity ends and participation begins. So there's this gap between the theory and how it's actually applied. The game changer, contextual factors. Let's set aside that activity and participation issue for now and focus on something really important, contextual factors. The old ICIDH, being focused on medical consequences, completely ignored these. But the ICF, it brings both environmental and personal factors into the picture. Here's why this matters. The same impairment doesn't affect everyone the same way. Think about it. A person who uses a wheelchair and works in a fully accessible office building might barely be inconvenienced by their mobility difference, but a pianist with even a minor finger injury, that could be career-ending. Context shapes everything. The challenge with personal factors. Now, here's where things get interesting and complicated. While the ICF classifies environmental factors pretty systematically, personal factors are left much more open-ended. There's no formal classification system for them. Practitioners are basically left to figure it out themselves. Some researchers, like Marit Karula and her colleagues, think we need better classification of personal factors. They argue it could help with rehabilitation planning and save practitioners time. But there's a risk here too. If we make these classifications too rigid, we might lose the flexibility that professionals need to interpret each person's unique situation. And here's the deeper issue. Personal factors are inherently tied to what we call phenomenological dimensions. Basically, the subjective aspects of experience that resist being put into neat categories. The lived experience perspective. This brings us to a key figure in the ICF's development, philosopher and disability scholar Jerome Bickenbach. He pushed back against viewing disability purely through a medical lens. Instead, he advocated for recognizing what's called the lived experience of disability, a concept that became prominent in the 1990s through phenomenological and disability studies. For example, how would you respond to this voice? It's me, the one with what you call a disability. Don't decide my health for me. Bickenbach argued that disability emerges from the interaction between individuals and their social environment. It's not just about what's wrong with someone's body. It's about relationships, context, and experience. This aligns with insights from ecological psychology and modern cognitive science, which emphasize how important context and embodied experience are. Here's the thing. Standardized classifications give us an external viewpoint, a way to categorize and communicate. But the subjective, lived perspective often tells a completely different story. Reimagining the ICF diagram. If you look at the standard ICF diagram, you'll see different components, including body functions and structures, activities and participation, health conditions, and contextual factors, each in their own space. Since the relationships between these elements are what matter most, we can actually rearrange this diagram in 3 dimensions to better express the ICF's original concept. In this 3D version, health and disability conditions emerge from the dynamic interplay among all these classifications, with contextual factors influencing how we interpret everything. But even this 3-dimensional representation has a problem. It doesn't really capture that phenomenological focus we talked about. A new way of seeing, the phenomenological approach. So let's try a different approach. Imagine placing contextual factors at the very center, represented by a circle that fuses personal and environmental factors together. Why together? Because it's actually impossible to clearly separate environmental and personal factors in real life. Think about it. A person's inner world, what phenomenologists call their life world, is always intertwined with how they perceive their environment. You can't fully separate social attitudes from personal identity, for instance. The ICF's classifications, including body functions, disability categories, and participation measures, sit outside an individual's life world. They're standardized frameworks that help us communicate and document. But by themselves, they don't represent anyone's lived reality. These classifications only become meaningful when they're interpreted and experienced within someone's actual life. Health and disability as dynamic experience. From this phenomenological perspective, health and disability aren't fixed categories that you either have or don't have. Instead, they emerge through dynamic interaction among your body, your environment, and your subjective experience. In this view, the ICF doesn't define what condition a person has. Rather, it offers terms that help articulate and make sense of lived experiences. Just like naming a disease can guide treatment, naming a disability can reduce stigma and support social action. Recognition through language can be the first step toward change. Flipping the script. Here's where things get really interesting. In the traditional use of the ICF, contextual factors are treated as qualifiers for the main classification categories. But from a phenomenological perspective, we can flip this around. The standardized classifications themselves become qualifiers, tools to interpret and articulate the meaning of contextual, lived experiences. The framework stays the same, but the perspective shifts completely. Instead of starting with categories and applying them to individuals, we begin with lived experience and use the classifications to describe and communicate it. This reinterpretation doesn't require changing the ICF itself. It just calls for reconsidering how we use the framework in practice. And there are already numerous phenomenological case studies that support this approach. Conclusion: a tool grounded in experience. By shifting our perspective while keeping the structure intact, the ICF can be reframed as a tool that's grounded in experience rather than imposed from the outside. This allows for a more flexible, reflective approach to practice, one that stays aligned with the complexity of human life. The ICF becomes not just a classification system, but a language for understanding and communicating the rich, complex reality of how people actually live with and experience disability and health. Gracias, amigos! Thank you for watching this video. If you'd like to read the full text, please visit my Medium story. You can also download the text source and figures from my Google Drive.